Hey guys, tonight we're going to uncover the secret behind the story of Anne of Cleves, once branded the Flanders Mare by a cruel rumour that Henry VIII, upon laying eyes on her, could not consummate their marriage on the wedding night. But what really happened? Was she truly as hideous as they claimed? Or was it all an elaborate ruse to conceal an even more astonishing truth? And what if I told you it was all a lie? A meticulously crafted deception that has fooled historians for nearly 500 years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment below letting me know where you are and what the local time is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes and imagine before you the dim, misty scene of early 1540 at Rochester Castle, where fog clings to the ancient stone walls. In a chamber bathed in pale candlelight, motes of dust drift slowly through the chilly air. Outside the window, the wind sighs through the cracks, as if whispering age-old tales, while inside a rotund king, weighing 300 pounds and limping with a foul, gangrenous wound its stench, so pervasive that courtiers 3 rooms away grimace at each breath, is preparing for a most peculiar act of romance. In a drunken impulse to rekindle passion, he disguises himself as a stranger, draping himself in a somber cloak and pulling a hood low over his face. His suede boots scrape heavily against the cold flagstones with each laboured step, sending faint tremors through the floor. He approaches a thick oak door, flashes a crooked grin at his reflection in a small mirror, then throws the door open, his ragged breath flooding the room with an overpowering odour that lingers in every corner. Anne, freshly arrived from a distant land, stands by the window, gazing out at the snow-blanketed gardens, exhausted after her storm-tossed journey. Homesickness weighs on her heart. Suddenly, 6 figures in matching garments burst in, but only one. An enormous stranger, exuding earth-like rot, lunges forward to seize her. His hands clamp around her shoulders. His chest presses against her weary form, and he forces his rancid breath toward her lips like spoiled honey, a stench that would make any bystander recoil. Instead of screaming, Anne remains strikingly composed. She raises a hand and gently pushes him away, a gesture both polite and resolute, then turns back to the window. Moonlight filters through the haze, softening her features as if reminding her never to relinquish her dignity. No complaint escapes her lips. No tears fall. Only the decisive action of a lady who has preserved her identity amid the storm. That moment evokes the image of a woman confronted by coercion, yet steadfast in her self-respect. It was never about any flaw in her appearance, but about the wounded pride of a king who had just been rejected. Henry, once the mightiest sovereign in England, found himself bested by a woman who did not even recognize him. This romantic failure was not merely a personal blot. It ignited a campaign to sully Anne's honour for the next 5 centuries. As the king's bewildered courtiers rushed in to report the failed ruse, Henry's fury flared, and he resolved to reclaim control. He would not permit himself to be vanquished before the world. So he concocted slanders about Anne's figure and person, spreading rumours of the Flanders Mare with her grotesque form and unpleasant odour. All served to mask the humiliating truth that he, a man who had once executed his own wife, had been overwhelmed by weakness in a fleeting, vulnerable moment. Thus, Anne of Cleves' story transformed from a dramatic episode in a bedchamber into a dark legend, amplified through generations until the world believed that the fragile heart of a once revered king had been spurned solely because of her looks. Yet it was in that crucible of defamation that Anne emerged as an emblem of resilience, an ordinary woman brave enough to safeguard her dignity against the tremors of power. In the stillness that followed the nightmare, only the image remained of a lady turning her back to the moonlight, unbowed and steadfast, ready to wage her own battle for honour across 5 centuries. After that shock, Henry VIII could not allow himself to appear weak. In the hush of candlelit corridors, he summoned his personal physician and commanded him to record every intimate detail of Anne's body. As though it were a medical dossier to be judged by the entire court, he insisted that she was no longer a virgin, that her breasts had begun to sag, that her waist had grown loose, and that her very scent was so offensive it could never stir desire in even the most ardent lover. These whispered accusations did not remain confined to the inner chambers. Henry ensured they spread like wildfire through the palace, reaching the ears of ambassadors, courtiers, and even the judges of the realm. His goal was simple, yet ruthless, to shift blame from his own infirmity, from the relentless pain of his festering wound and the heavy weight of advancing years, onto the supposed atrocious appearance of his new bride. At first, Anne's visitors, the French envoy, the Spanish diplomat, and even Henry's own trusted representative, had all praised Holbein's portrait as remarkably accurate. They spoke of a woman of moderate beauty and graceful bearing, not a creature to be despised. Yet these voices of reason were swiftly silenced beneath the weight of royal decree and whispered threats. Courtiers who dared to mention Anne's pleasant looks found themselves drawn into the king's narrative, their memories and journals revised to echo his scorn. Every letter sent back to foreign courts, every anecdote shared in the smoky glow of tavern hearths, began to parrot the same cruel refrain. Anne was grotesque. Anne was repulsive. And Henry had been justified in spurning her. As the rumours multiplied, the story took on a life of its own. Women in the palace kitchens whispered in frightened tones that Anne's undergarments were stuffed to hide deformities. Nobles in velvet cloaks repeated tales of servants fainting at her approach. Even the tapestries lining the grand hall seemed to absorb the gossip, their woven scenes of hunts and feasts, now serving as silent witnesses to a tragedy of reputation. Nobody dared challenge the fib. Henry's authority loomed too large. His courtiers, keen to curry favour, contributed their own embellishments. Her nose was too long, her skin too dark, her attire too odd, her gait too stiff. With each echo, the legend grew more grotesque, until the phrase Flanders Mare became shorthand for ugliness in every nook of the kingdom. And yet, in the small hours before dawn, when the castle was draped in velvet shadows, a few loyal attendants remembered the truth. They recalled Anne's soft laughter as she learned to speak English, her gentle smile when she offered gifts to grateful servants, the way her silken gowns swept the marble floors without a hint of the monstrous form the king had described. But such recollections were like whispers against a roaring wind. They could not compete with the king's thunderous proclamations. The chroniclers who dared record Anne's elegance found their manuscripts lost or altered, their words replaced by scathing critiques that mirrored Henry's own bitter heart. The myth took root beyond England's shores, carried on the winds of court gossip to faraway realms. By the time scholars penned histories a century later, the tale had been enshrined in ink as unquestionable fact. Playwrights on London stages delighted audiences with cruel jests at Anne's expense. Painters darkened her portrait to accentuate supposed flaws. The name Flanders Mare echoed in lecture halls and drawing rooms alike, a testament to how power can rewrite beauty, how authority can transform a real woman into a figment of malice. Behind closed doors, Anne endured each fresh wave of mockery with remarkable composure. She studied the court's etiquette, refined her speech, and perfected her gentle nods. When the ladies in waiting looked at her with pity, she would offer reassurance with a soft hand on their sleeves. Though her heart must have trembled at each new slur, she never publicly broke. Instead, she wove her own subtle form of resistance, kindness that could not be slandered, quiet generosity that shone through the darkest rumours, and a dignity that no amount of vile gossip could mar. By the time the court moved on to new intrigues and fresh scandals, the memory of the hideous Anne of Cleves had solidified into a legend more enduring than any truth. Historians wrote of her as though she had never lived beyond the insult itself. Yet her very survival, amid such orchestrated cruelty, spoke volumes. The real Anne was a woman of courage and grace, who faced the world's worst calumny and refused to be defined by it. In the hush of Rochester's ancient stones, long after Henry's proclamations faded, their quiet resilience remained, waiting for another dawn to cast its gentle light upon a story too long concealed in shadow. Thực tế, Anne of Cleves trở thành hôn thê chỉ vì một bức chân dung. Năm 1539, Anh quốc đang bị các thế lực Công giáo bao vây, đe dọa xâm lược. Thomas Cromwell, bộ trưởng quyền lực của Henry, muốn lập liên minh với Đức để củng cố hàng phòng ngự phong trào Tin lành. Anne là em gái của công tước Cleves, cai quản vùng đất chiến lược. Vua Henry chưa từng gặp bà. Chỉ căn cứ vào bức họa do Hans Holbein vẽ. Holbein là họa sĩ cung đình lừng danh với phong cách trung thực, không tâng bốc. Bức chân dung miêu tả Anne với mái tóc vàng, đôi mắt hạt phỉ, làn da mịn màng và bộ trang phục đỏ vàng uy nghi. Khi các đại sứ Anh đến gặp Anne, họ đều xác nhận chính xác y như tranh, thật sự không có sự ngụy tạo. Đến năm 2024, lễ phục chế tại Bảo tàng Louvre đã lau rửa lớp bụi, khôi phục màu sắc ban đầu, chứng minh Anne không xấu xí, chỉ là một phụ nữ bình thường, duyên dáng. Sự kiện này phá tan lời vu khống của Henry, công khai đưa sự thật ra ánh sáng sau gần 5 thế kỷ bị lãng quên. In the hushed corridors of royal memory, that single canvas had carried the hopes and anxieties of an entire kingdom. Imagine those dusty Louvre galleries in autumn light, as the conservators gently whisked away layer after layer of grime, revealing beneath the century's dark veil a young woman of measured grace. Her golden hair, once obscured by time's murky patina, gleamed once more. Her hazel eyes, long clouded, shone with quiet intelligence, and her fair skin, now visible in its natural glow, spoke not of a monstrous deformity, but of a lived life. Marked by gentle laughter and noble poise, it was a revelation both simple and profound. The Anne of Cleves depicted by Holbein was a true likeness, neither an idealized beauty nor a caricature of ugliness. She was, in every sense, an ordinary yet dignified woman, possessing that elusive quality of presence which turns mere representation into portraiture. And yet, for hundreds of years, this portrait had been buried under layers of political expedience and malicious slander, much like the thick layers of varnish that hid her from posterity. Consider the weight of that moment in 2024. When the restored painting was unveiled, a hush must have descended upon the Louvre's Grand Hall as scholars and visitors alike took in the living colours and subtle contours, long thought lost. Historians, who had grown accustomed to citing Henry's allegations as immutable fact, paused to reconsider. Art lovers, who had admired Holbein's technique without knowing the subject's true appearance, found themselves face to face with the genuine article, a woman of composure and poise, her features neither stunning nor repulsive, but imbued with a quiet strength. This was more than an art world triumph. It was a reclamation of identity. In an instant, the centuries of whispers and smirks about the ugly bride lost their foundation. The evidence was no longer confined to dusty archives or tepid ambassadorial reports. It hung before your eyes in muted reds and golds, in the graceful tilt of a head, in the soft interplay of light and shadow on cheekbones restored. And yet, the political tide of 1540 had been set by that very portrait. Henry, staring at Holbein's accurate rendering, had embraced the alliance with Cleves and unwittingly signed his own reputation to a gamble he could not win. He had trusted his eye to lead him to marital bliss, only to find that true longing does not spring from pigment and brushstroke, but from the meeting of hearts and minds. In that distracted moment by the window at Rochester, when the disguised king stumbled and Anne recoiled, the difference between representation and reality became heartbreakingly clear. So the boulder of slander began its slow roll down the hills of history. Each echo of court gossip, each repetition in foreign dispatches, each flourish of Henry's cruel rhetoric piled upon the next, turning a single incident of wounded pride into the bedrock of myth. She was so hideous. They said he could not consummate the marriage. But the painting, restored and luminous, stood as irrefutable proof. The problem had never been her face, but his failing body and bruised vanity. In the gentle hush that follows the storm, we can almost hear Anne's soft laughter as she discovered the truth of her own likeness. She must have known, deep in her heart, that the canvas held more power than any royal decree. She would walk past that portrait, day after day, perhaps reflecting on the irony that a painting once her passport to England had also become the instrument of her defamation. Yet it was this very painting that, centuries later, would vindicate her name. As we drift through these recollections, let us remember that history often hides its treasures under layers of varnished political motives. Whispered slanders, convenient. It takes time, patience, and a steady hand to remove those layers, to let the true colours shine. And when they do, as they did for Anne of Cleves in 2024, the revelation can be nothing short of miraculous. In the portraits restored by dedicated hands, we find not only art but the justice denied to a woman who, long ago, was pilloried for a beauty she always possessed. As we gaze upon her restored visage, we reconnect with the real person beneath the legend, a woman of quiet dignity, resilient spirit, and a grace that time could not tarnish. Now let us drift back to that welcome ceremony for Anne at Rochester on an early morning in the year 1540. Picture her weary form. Having endured days of relentless snowstorms and bitter cold, wandering into a strange land where no familiar tongue greeted her ears, she stood at the edge of the courtyard, her breath floating ghost-like in the frigid air, watching a spectacle of bull-baiting unfolding before her eyes. Crimson blood spattered across the pristine white snow, and the snarling hounds tore at the chained creature, their feral howls echoing through the fortress walls. Anne's heart must have sank at that brutal display, an unsettling introduction to English entertainments that no gentle soul would seek. Yet she stood there, adjusting the folds of her heavy cloak, shoulders straight, chin lifted, learning to bear a culture not her own. Before she could gather her courage to retreat indoors and escape the gruesome carnival, 6 mounted men in matching dark cloaks thundered into the courtyard. Their horses' hooves clattered on icy stones, and a swirl of chipped snow rose in their wake. Amid those 6 figures, one loomed larger, more untamed, a stranger with a hulking frame that bulged at the seams of his disguise. He limped forward, each step a jarring thud that reverberated through the yard. A stench, foul as rotten meat left in the sun, trailed him like a sinister cloak. Without warning, the massive man seized Anne by the shoulders, his sweaty palms clamping against her fine gown, and lunged forward in a graceless attempt to press his lips upon hers. For a moment, Anne was rooted to the spot by shock and revulsion. She did not scream or sob. The cold seemed to still her voice. Instead, she steadied her breath, summoned the height of her composure, and calmly extended her hand to push him away. Her fingers pressed into his chest in a gesture both firm and polite, enough to unbalance him. In that tiny motion, she made a declaration. She would not be overpowered, nor would she be shamed. Turning back to the window, she allowed her gaze to wander across the courtyard once more. The moonlight, veiled by drifting snow, cast a soft glow upon her serene profile. As though offering solace and shielding her dignity, Anne's shoulders relaxed. But her posture remained regal, an unspoken proclamation that she would not yield, even as the cold wind bit at her cheeks. 20 minutes later, the same hulking figure reappeared, now dressed in sumptuous cloth of gold that shimmered against the dim torchlight. A hush fell over the assembled guards and onlookers as a herald announced in a clear, resonant voice, "Behold Henry VIII, King of England, In that instant, the stranger's awkward guise dissolved into royal splendor. Anne's calm facade must have flickered with realization, as she understood she had just rejected the most powerful man in the realm. To spurn a king was no trivial matter. In that moment, she stood on the precipice between life and death. A scorned sovereign could command the sharpest blade, and Anne had dared to turn away. Yet she did not flinch. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of startled recognition and quiet resolve, met those of the great monarch now stripped of disguise. And instead of crumpling, she offered him the same dignified grace she had shown the impostor. Henry himself, we can imagine, was taken aback. His lips, accustomed to commanding armies and issuing decrees, parted in astonishment. For all the king's wealth and might, his feelings hung naked in the frosty air, wounded pride and bitter humiliation. The courtiers, watching in hushed awe, witnessed a reversal of power more dramatic than any battlefield blow. A woman who had not known him, who had never heard his voice until that very moment, had refused his embrace when he came as a stranger. In the hush that followed, the ritual of greeting could not proceed as planned. Anne, guided by her noble attendants, slipped away to the warmth of the inner chambers, her cloak wrapped tightly around her against the cold. Henry, still standing amid the stirred-up snow, watched her retreating form, the golden light of his fine robes clashing with the pale moonlight on the icy stones. He must have felt the weight of every gaze upon him, every whispered speculation that crossed the courtyard. The memory of that night would linger in the corridors of Rochester Castle for weeks to come. Guards would recount the tale of the maiden's composure, and servants would speak of the sudden hush that fell when the stranger revealed himself as monarch. Anne's single, measured push, so delicate yet so determined, would be retold as if it were a tournament victory. Yet behind that slender gesture lay more than courage. It was a testament to her unyielding sense of self. She showed that nobility resides not in bloodline alone, but in the refusal to surrender one's dignity, even when faced with the enormity of royal power. And as the chill of the night gave way to the pale light of dawn, the memory of that encounter crystallized into legend, one that would be recounted over candlelit tables and in hushed nursery rhymes, transforming a moment of personal defiance into an enduring emblem of grace under pressure. So in the sleepy stillness of those February nights, when the hearth fires crackled and the wind sighed against the stone walls, the story of Anne's quiet strength spread like a whispered lullaby. It reminded the dreamers among us that courage often manifests not in grandiose rebellion, but in the soft, resolute declaration of one soul's unbroken dignity. Henry had believed, with the naive confidence of a romantic hero, that true love could pierce any disguise, much like the tales of Arthurian knights, gallantly wandering in ragged cloaks, guided by the steadfast devotion of their beloveds. He told himself that Anne's heart, pure and loyal, would recognize him no matter the costume. Yet when she failed to identify the disguised monarch, he did not pause to consider the absurdity of expecting recognition from a woman she had never met. He did not wonder if she had been warned of such a test, or if she would understand its whimsical premise. In his wounded pride, he seized upon that moment of confusion as proof that Anne harboured no affection for him. His fury swiftly morphed into royal decree. Thomas Cromwell, ever the efficient minister, found himself drenched in sweat as he witnessed the king's fury boiling over like a cauldron on a battlefield. Courtiers and clerks, usually so careful with their words, were commanded to craft and repeat a damning narrative. Anne was not the fair bride he had imagined, but a grotesque figure unworthy of his bed. That portrait must have been painted with too generous a hand. They echoed. It did not do justice to her real appearance. Even the most steadfast ambassadors, who had earlier praised Holbein's genuine likeness, were forced to bow to the royal consensus. Their initial testimonies were buried beneath layers of whispered endorsements of Henry's new tale. Nonetheless, the wedding proceeded as planned on the 6th of January, in the grand halls of Greenwich Palace. The chamber was draped in sumptuous tapestries of crimson and gold, flickering with the light of 100 candles. Henry himself seemed to embody the essence of that lavish decor, a figure of opulence in armor gilded with real gold leaf. His crown set with priceless gems. Anne, by contrast, wore a gown of shimmering silver brocade, the fabric catching every glint of torchlight as she moved with quiet dignity down the aisle. The assembled nobles, their breath visible in the cold air, murmured in admiration at the bride's refined beauty, even as they dared not meet the king's dour gaze. Yet beneath the splendor, tension crackled like embers in a dying hearth. Henry, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of his ceremonial cloak, offered curt nods to the assembled guests, but spoke few words to his new wife. He drank deeply from a bejeweled goblet, the rich wine spilling in ruby rivulets along his gauntlet. Each swallow seemed to fuel his melancholy, and soon he turned his gaze toward Catherine Howard, the Duke's niece. Barely 15 years old, her youth a stark contrast to the bride's composed maturity. Whispers spread like wildfire already. His attentions had shifted, and Catherine's blushing cheeks bespoke both excitement and fear. That night's pageantry gave way to an infamous wedding feast. Tables groaned with roasted meats and candied fruits, while minstrels played soft melodies intended to calm the nerves. But calm was elusive. Anne sat beside her new husband under a canopy of velvet, the rustle of her silver gown almost drowned by the clink of goblets. Henry raised his cup in a half-hearted toast, his hand unsteady. When he tried to lean toward Anne to murmur words of affection, he found his body unresponsive. His limbs, heavy with drink and hindered by age and illness, would not obey his desires. The centuries-old wound in his leg throbbed fiercely, and his head spun with the warmth of too much wine. In the darkened privacy of their chambers, Anne lay waiting, her heart fluttering with nervous anticipation. The torchlight danced upon the tapestries, casting fleeting shadows across the cold stone floor. She wore a night veil of silk and linen, embroidered with delicate pearls. When Henry entered, too slow and unsteady to raise his arms properly, she heard his deep breaths, laboured and sour. He approached her bedchamber as if it were a stage set for tragedy. But there was no kiss, no embrace, no promise of new beginnings. Instead, the king stumbled away, muttering something about failing at his sacred duties. Anne, unsure at first, reached out to him with a gentle touch, hoping to guide him back. Yet he recoiled, nursing his wounded ego as much as his festering leg. In that moment, Anne realized that her wedding night would not be shared in whispered declarations or tender embraces, but would instead become fodder for whispers of ulterior motives, of bodily failings, entirely divorced from any truth of appearance or feeling. To conceal his own impotence, Henry unleashed a torrent of malicious rumours. He claimed that Anne's body, revealed under moonlight, was unfit for affection, that her breasts hung too low, that her midsection lacked firmness, that her scent was so repugnant it repelled desire. He instructed his physician to corroborate these slanders, ensuring that every claim carried the weight of medical authority. This was not a personal grievance contained within the chamber walls. It was a full-scale assault on Anne's reputation, broadcast to every corner of his realm. Every courtier, every clerk, every wandering troubadour soon knew the king's explanation. Anne was too hideous to arouse him. English taverns echoed with the morose refrain, and foreign ambassadors cabled their monarchs with tales of the bride's deficiencies. The legend of the Flanders Mare was reborn, reinforced by the king's relentless propaganda machine. It mattered not that the portraits had proven her ordinary beauty. It mattered not that her attendants spoke of her kindness and decorum. The greater power of Henry's voice, echoing across the frozen battlements of Nottingham to the bustling docks of Bristol, dominated all lesser truths. And so, the wedding night. Tragedy became an enduring myth, a lesson in how authority can warp reality. The bride's gentle dignity, displayed in a simple gesture of refusal, was subsumed by the roar of a burned-out king's wounded pride. But as the candles guttered and the dawn crept pale across the horizon, Anne remained unbroken. In her silent resilience lay the seed of a different story, a story of a woman who, though cast as a villain in her own tale, would ultimately outlive her slanderers and reclaim her name by the quiet strength of her grace. After that so-called failed wedding night, Henry VIII could not in good conscience admit his impotence. Such an admission would shatter the aura of invincibility he had carefully cultivated for decades. Instead, he devised a ruthless campaign to tarnish Anne's reputation and deflect attention from his own frailty. In the quiet hours before dawn, he summoned his trusted physician and ordered a clandestine examination of her body, as though it were evidence in a criminal trial. Every intimate detail, the alleged sagging breasts, the distended belly, the indescribable odor, and the rough, unforgiving skin was meticulously recorded in the royal medical ledger. These salacious reports were not left to gather dust in some hidden archive. Henry instructed his courtiers to spread the slander far and wide to palace gossipers in the Great Hall, to whispering maids in the kitchens, and even to the foreign ambassadors who filled the London streets. Any dissenting voice, a lady-in-waiting who remembered Anne's gentle composure, or a nobleman who had admired her gracious bearing at formal gatherings, was swiftly silenced. Journals were corrected to reflect the king's new narrative. Letters home from diplomats were rewritten to echo the same cruel refrain. No details were considered too trivial or vulgar for public consumption. The strategy was simple: transform Anne's ordinary appearance into incontrovertible proof of her ugliness, thereby justifying the king's own failure. The courtiers, keen to curry favour and fearful of falling out of grace, complied with hurried nods and whispered endorsements. They described her gait as awkward, her attire as eccentric, and her demeanour as cold. Even her laughter, once soft and alluring, became forced and hollow in official reports. By the time the rumours reached the taverns along the Thames, they had metastasized into grotesque caricatures of the woman who had stood serenely in Holbein's portrait. Yet Anne refused to let these malicious attacks crush her spirit. Each morning, she rose before dawn to practice English, reciting phrases in a voice that melded earnest effort with fragile hope. She discarded heavy foreign gowns in favour of simpler English gowns, enlisting the help of her ladies to ensure she blended into her adopted homeland's courtly customs. When she encountered new courtiers, she offered them warm smiles and gracious greetings, determined to replace their scorn with courtesy. All the while, her husband continued to shun her company, favouring the company of his youthful niece, Catherine Howard, whose laughter rang out brightly in the corridors as Anne's name echoed in hushed contempt. In the vast network of palace intrigue, Anne's resilience became a quiet marvel. While the king's narrative dominated the public sphere, privately she cultivated alliances of compassion and trust. Servants risked reprimand by discreetly offering her comforting words. Foreign envoys acknowledged in private conversations that the accusations against her lacked substance, but these murmured consolations were fragile against the weight of royal decree. For every kind word spoken in the shadows, 10 salacious rumours blazed in the daylight courts. Henry, meanwhile, took perverse satisfaction in the spectacle he had orchestrated. He revelled in retelling anecdotes of Anne's alleged deficiencies at banquets, ensuring every sip of wine was accompanied by a fresh volley of insults. Chroniclers recorded each barbed jest, and the rumour mill churned with tireless energy. Elizabethan playwrights, some who had once admired Anne's poised demeanour, now crafted comedies in which a caricature of the Flanders lady was lampooned mercilessly. The slur Flanders Mare echoed through crowded theatres, entwining itself with bawdy laughter. Yet among her adversaries, Anne's true character shone brightest in small acts of kindness. She quietly sent care packages of warm cloaks to guards posted at the bitterly cold northern gates. She instructed her steward to provide extra rations for weary couriers returning from distant embassies. Rumour has it she even opened her private chapel for common folk to pray for their sick, though the king's propagandists insisted she did so as a last-ditch effort to mask her supposed repulsiveness. In truth, these gestures sprang from genuine compassion, a testament to Anne's unwavering empathy. As the weeks and months passed, the king's fury and the court's scorn began to lose some of their sting. The once sturdy walls of Henry's slander campaign showed tiny cracks whenever Anne entered a room with a dignified "good morrow" or a genuine "thank you." Noble women, having seen the kindness she extended to their children during charitable visits, found it difficult to sustain their ridicule. Evan Thomas Cromwell, though he sweated and muttered under the weight of his orders, privately expressed admiration for her quiet endurance, though he dared not voice it in public. In the grand tapestry of Tudor politics, Anne's story became an undercurrent of empathy that pulsed beneath the harsh fabric of power. The king's narrative, though temporarily triumphant, held no true substance. It was sustained only by his own desperation and the fear he inspired. Anne's patient, steadfast response served as a gentle reminder that dignity, once claimed, cannot be easily revoked. By the time the first blossoms of spring began to push through the frost-hardened earth, whispers of a possible annulment circulated once more. Henry, whose wounded pride smouldered like an ember, weighed his options. He had achieved his political alliance with Cleves, but at the price of personal disgrace. As he contemplated his next move, whether to release Anne from the crown's fetters or to cling to his slanderous narrative, she continued to navigate the treacherous currents of court life with a composed grace that belied her inner strength. And so, in the hushed dawns and candlelit evenings of Greenwich Palace, Anne's unspoken question lingered in the air. Could a princess's quiet resilience outlast a king's roaring deceit? In the delicate balance between rumour and reality, she stood as living proof that a woman's worth need not be measured by the words of those who fear the vulnerability of truth. Her story, spoken softly, almost in a whisper, remained a lullaby of courage for those who knew to listen beyond the din of royal decree. By the spring of 1540, Henry had already secured a new fascination, Catherine Howard, the youthful niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Barely 15 years old, and as radiant as early morning sunlight on dewy grass, their liaison unfolded like a spectacle in the palace corridors. Henry daringly bestowed upon her glittering jewels that would have made queens envious, parading her at festive processions cloaked in silks and velvets of the richest hues. Whispers echoed through the great hall that his intentions were unmistakable, for he spoke openly of plans to wed again, even though Anne, his lawful wife, still occupied the royal bedchamber. Faced with this brazen courtship, Anne found herself cornered by fate and forced into a cruel ultimatum. She could challenge Henry's claims of impotency in a perilous legal proceeding, one fraught with the possibility of a perilous conviction and a fate akin to that of Anne Boleyn, or she could consent to an annulment, trading the threat of the scaffold for the security of becoming the wealthiest widow in all of England. No choice could be deemed just. One path led to almost certain doom, the other to a gilded exile from marital bonds. Yet Anne, ever resourceful, revealed a cunning wisdom beyond her years. When the matter of consummation was brought before the court, the barristers and bishops of the realm gathered to scrutinize her testimony. They asked if Henry had managed to perform his marital duties with her, expecting perhaps a confession of failure. But Anne answered in a tone so guileless, so innocent, that the listeners leaned forward in hushed curiosity. She recounted that each evening the king would lean down to place a gentle kiss upon her cheek, whispering a tender good night, only to bid her farewell. As dawn approached, she professed, with wide-eyed sincerity, that she had believed this nightly kiss to fulfill the entirety of her marital obligations, for she knew nothing of the carnal rites she was expected to understand. Her statement, though seemingly naive, was legally astute. It acknowledged no tangible consummation, thereby supplying Henry with the evidence he needed to claim non-consummation. Yet it did so without implicating her in any wrongdoing or deception. The court members, shifting in their carved oak seats, I found themselves confronted by a paradox. This young princess, accused of coarseness, spoke with a clarity so piercing that no one could credibly challenge her honesty. The judges, moved by the simplicity and truth of her words, had no recourse but to acknowledge that the marriage, in the eyes of the law, had indeed remained unfulfilled. With that, the annulment was finalized in July of 1540, executed with such haste that the ink on the royal edict barely had time to dry. Henry cited two grounds. First, the absence of conjugal consummation. Second, a prior betrothal. Anne had entered at the age of 12 to the Duke of Lorraine. A contract she insisted had been dissolved years earlier. Within days, he celebrated his nuptials to Catherine Howard, as though freed from any taint of scandal. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, whose political fortunes were bound to the success of this manoeuvre, watched anxiously from the shadows, too aware that any misstep could cost him everything. For Anne, the annulment delivered both relief and an unexpected boon. She emerged from the ordeal, not as a disgraced wife, but as a widow in title, bestowed with a generous jointure and estates befitting a princess of her stature. Richmond Palace became her sanctuary, a place where she could host quiet gatherings and cultivate friendships with less fear of courtly intrigue. She learned the subtleties of English customs, refining her accent and mastering the etiquette of her adoptive land. Courtiers, once forced to deride her beauty, now greeted her with genuine respect, intrigued by the woman who had navigated her perilous predicament with such deftness. In the hush of candlelit evenings, Anne would stroll through the palace gardens, tracing the dew-laden paths with measured steps. The breath of early summer blossoms mingled with the promise of renewal, and she revelled in the gentle knowledge that her autonomy had been reclaimed. Though the scandal of her first marriage lingered like a faint shadow, she refused to let it define her. Instead, she transformed her title into a seal of dignity, proving that a woman's agency could thrive even amid the most formidable constraints. Catherine Howard's star, by contrast, burned bright but swiftly. The court's attention was now torn between the acknowledged widow and the fresh bride, each occupying her own niche in Henry's capricious heart. Anne, with her quiet resilience and diplomatic grace, became an unexpected figure of authority, a living testament to the paradox that strength often lies in yielding. She had turned the king's demands into her salvation, crafting a narrative that preserved both her life and her honour. Thus, in the tapestry of Tudor court life, Anne of Cleves sewed a thread of unexpected brilliance, a woman who, forced to choose between death and dishonour, had instead chosen survival and self-respect. As the summer sun cast its warm glow over the palace walls, she stood unbowed, a princess whose keen wit and serene composure had outlasted the storm of royal caprice, forever altering the course of her own destiny. In the gentle hush of July 1540, the royal seal was pressed upon the decree of annulment with scarcely a moment's hesitation. Henry, keen to close the chapter on his first marriage, invoked two principal grounds: that the marriage had never been consummated, and, as a rhetorical flourish, that Anne had once been betrothed in her 12th year to the Duke of Lorraine, a contract, she insisted, long since dissolved, yet presented now as incontrovertible proof. No ceremony marked the annulment's finality, but in its quiet, bureaucratic sweep, it severed bonds that seemed destined to stand, leaving Henry free to pursue a new dawn of affection. Barely days later, in a display at once swift and brazen, Henry wed Catherine Howard, the Duke's niece of just 15 summers. The court's courtiers, clad in gowns of rich velvet and doublets of gleaming brocade, gaped at the sight. The king, newly rid of one wife by papal dispensation, now clasped hands with another, whose youthful face shone like fresh morning light, as jewels sparkled against Catherine's coral-hued gowns. Whispers surged through the corridors that Henry's heart, so recently wounded, now burned anew with the embers of teenage innocence. Yet even as Catherine assumed the mantle of queen, Henry's wrath found its next victim, Thomas Cromwell. Once the indispensable architect of statecraft and a sculptor of alliances, learned in bitter fashion that proximity to triumph could invert to proximity to disgrace. With the same swift hand that had granted him power, Henry levelled accusations of treason, each word a blade poised above Cromwell's head. The King's Council, ever eager to curry favour, sealed the verdict, and within days, Cromwell fell, his titles stripped, his estates confiscated. He took his final breaths as a cautionary tale that any who meddled in the affairs of the Anne debacle might likewise meet a grim end. Amid this flurry of downfall and devouring ambition, Anne of Cleves emerged with a most unexpected fortune, freed from the chains of marriage. She was allotted a jointure, so generous it vaulted her into the ranks of England's wealthiest widows. Richmond Palace, a stately residence beside the Thames, became her charge. Its gardens, once echoing with the sighs of royal intrigue, now witnessed her quiet footsteps among lilac bushes and fountain pools. The income granted to her each year afforded not only comfort, but influence. She could patronize local artisans, commission embroidered tapestries, or dine with aldermen and merchants in the city's bustling heart. Where other wives of Henry had suffered exile to bleak manors or faced darker fates upon wooden scaffolds, Anne walked free under the wide English sky. Her dinners were not sombre affairs of whispered accusations, but jovial gatherings of friends and family, set beneath pergolas and swaying lanterns. Gentle strains of the lute accompanied her laughter, and ministers of the cloister joined her in earnest discourse on theology, for she had come to embrace the rhythms of the new Protestant faith. Anne's education in English culture unfolded like the slow turning of a kaleidoscope each day, revealed a fresh pattern of customs and courtesies. She learned to curtsy just so, to speak with the clipped vowels of the court, and to navigate the complex ceremonies of the Privy Council's reception rooms. She studied in the palace library, leafing through chronicles of her new land, tracing its storied past with delicate fingers. In return, she taught her English companions the lilting German lullabies of her homeland, their notes drifting through candlelit halls like distant memories of home. Her relationships with the leading figures of the capital deepened into genuine bonds. Alderman Thomas More, perhaps recalling his own painful dealings with royal favour and fallout, admired her steadfast integrity. Lady Mary Brandon, once a young maid in Anne's own retinue, spoke of the princess's kindness in sending warm cloaks to refugees and food to the poor. Even the formidable Archbishop Cranmer, a figure of ecclesiastical authority, offered his respect, noting her willingness to adapt her convictions for the sake of peace in the realm. As Catherine Howard's brief flame flickered and dimmed, Anne's star burned steadily bright. Though she had never borne Henry's children, nor claimed the Queen's name, she won a subtler crown, that of affection and esteem. Her sheltered rooms at Richmond became a sanctuary where scholars debated scripture and poets recited odes to her resilience. Children of nobles, once instructed to mock the Flanders Mare, now clung to her skirts, eager for tales of distant castles and loyal knights. In the twilight of those summer evenings, Anne would stroll through her private garden, the air perfumed by roses and honeysuckle. Fireflies blinked among the blossoms, and the distant murmur of the river reminded her that life, like the Thames itself, flowed onward despite obstacles. She paused by a marble fountain, its water glimmering like spun silver, and offered a quiet toast to survival to the woman she had once been, wrongly maligned, and to the woman she had become, unbowed and cherished. Thus, through the unpredictable currents of a court that could destroy its own, Anne of Cleves found a haven. Her story, once eclipsed by the shadow of regal fury, unfolded into a testament of adaptability and grace. In the embrace of Richmond's walls and the trust of those she befriended, she discovered that freedom and respect need not be born of power alone. They can bloom from the courage to meet adversity with a composed heart and an unbroken smile. 2 years later, in the year 1542, Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife, was accused of adultery and condemned to the scaffold. News of her downfall spread through the court like a chill wind, felling the gaiety of banquets and dimming the torches in the great hall. Yet in that moment of crisis, Anne of Cleves remained unshaken. She sat at her writing desk in the quiet of Richmond Palace, candlelight flickering upon her calm features, and composed a letter of condolence to Henry. Its tone was measured and courteous, offering sympathy without a trace of malice or triumph. She expressed sorrow for the sad news of your Majesty's grief, and concluded with respectful wishes for his health and comfort in sorrow. In that delicate missive lay Anne's insight into the art of survival at court. Appear often enough that the king remembers you, yet never so much as to provoke his ire. Her letter reached Henry's hands on a day when he needed reminders of loyalty rather than whispers of betrayal. Though the corridors buzzed with gossip about Howard's fall, Anne's words carried a gentle warmth that softened the edges of tragedy. Not long after, Henry took a sixth wife, Catherine Parr. A woman known for her learning and piety, Anne once again demonstrated her diplomatic grace. She sent a richly embroidered gift to the bride, and later graced the wedding festivities with her presence. Stepping lightly across the dancing floor in stately silver slippers, her participation spoke volumes. She stood in harmony with the new queen and the new dawn of Henry's ever-shifting affections. The guests, drawing breath to remark upon the unusual cordiality between Henry's former wife and his new, paused in surprise. But Anne moved through the throng with the ease of one who had mastered the rhythms of court life, leaving onlookers to marvel at her composure. When Henry VIII passed and his son Edward VI ascended the throne, one might have expected Anne's fortunes to falter with the change of ruler. Yet Edward, a boy king guided by regents, allowed Anne to retain her jointure and her palatial residence. Her properties, her income, and her role in the realm remained untouched. This continuity, rare among women in her position, owed much to her discreet conduct and the respect she had quietly cultivated among those who now held sway. Later still, when Mary I took the crown and restored the old faith, Anne faced yet another test of adaptability. The Catholic Restoration might have imperiled a Protestant sympathizer like herself, yet she navigated the change with unassuming tact. In the hushed corners of her private chapel, worn more by prayer than proclamation, she made her peace with the rites of the Mass. No grand declaration marked her conversion. Instead, she attended services alongside devout Catholics, offering pious bows and kneeling with sincere reverence. Her shift was subtle, a gesture of solidarity rather than opportunism, and it shielded her from suspicion and spared her the fate of less accommodating courtiers. Through these successive reigns, Anne's flexibility in faith and her discreet modulation of opinions sustained her safety. Where others might be swept away by accusations of heresy or loyalty, she navigated the currents of doctrine with measured steps. Guided by a principle she had formed, survival required both conviction and compromise. She held to her conscience in private, yet in public she bent her practices to the prevailing winds of power, preserving both her integrity and her life. In the late evening shadows of her final years, Anne would sometimes wander through the galleries of Richmond, her fingers trailing over tapestries depicting medieval hunts and pastoral scenes. The flicker of torchlight danced across her once-praised portrait, a reminder of the woman she had been and the legend she had transcended. Visitors who chanced upon her in those silent halls noted the serenity in her gaze, an acknowledgement of the tempests she had weathered, power struggles, royal caprice, and the harsh sting of court scandal. Her courtesy continued unabated, She composed messages of goodwill to both Edward and Mary, honouring their rule with gentle deference. Letters arrived from officials seeking her counsel or her blessing, and she responded with warmth, offering prayers for peace and letters of encouragement for the realm. She refused no petition from a humble maid seeking aid, dispatching coin from her coffers to the poor and funding repairs to the local parish church. Thus Anne of Cleves, once thrust into the violent winds of Tudor machinations, found her course not by resisting the gale, but by angling her sails with skillful subtlety. Her tenure in the palace, spanning 4 monarchs, became a testament to the power of poise and prudence. She learned, as few others did, that a woman's strength could lie as much in her adaptability as in her steadfastness, remaining constant in her kindness, yet flexible in her outward practice. By the time Queen Mary's reign gave way to the prospect of a new era, Anne remained a fixture of the court, a noble widow, a gracious diplomat in her own right, and a living bridge between tumultuous reigns. Her story, etched into the annals of history, whispered a lullaby of endurance and taste. In the quiet of Richmond's twilight gardens, one could almost hear the echoes of her soft-spoken prayers and see the glint of her silver shoes as she strolled under the gentle glow of lanterns, an enduring symbol of grace, sustaining her through the tempest of royal favour, and, forever outlasting the storms of scandal. Anne passed away in the year 1557, likely claimed by a cruel illness that we know today as cancer. In the hush of early morning, courtiers whispered that her final breath was drawn with the same quiet dignity that had defined her entire life at court. Her funeral was arranged with full royal honours at Westminster Abbey, a privilege reserved only for those of true royal blood. The abbey's soaring arches and stained glass windows, still bathed in the soft light of dawn, sheltered her procession as monks chanted solemn psalms. Nobles in black velvet cloaks stood at attention, their heads bowed in respect rather than scandal. At her tomb, the Latin inscription spoke not of the cruel slanders that had once shadowed her name, but of her virtues. Anne of Cleves, venerande memoriae principis pertu sapientiae et virtutis, qui in castitade et benignitade instaurata manabit, which, in a gentle whisper of translation, celebrates Anne of Cleves to venerable memory, a princess renowned for wisdom and virtue, whose modesty and kindness endure. There was no stigma in those words, no echo of the malicious rumours that had once painted her as a pariah. Instead, she was honoured as a devoted princess, a beacon of goodwill rather than a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, in the hush of the Louvre's conservation studio, centuries and miles away, restorers tended to Holbein's famed portrait of Anne. Once, the painting had been darkened and obscured under layers of 17th century varnish, its subject artificially softened, then later vilified to advance the cruel narrative of the Flanders Mare. But in 1550, Severn's echo across time, specifically in 2024, these conservators carefully removed decades of accumulated grime and discoloured varnish, revealing the true strokes of the master's hand. With each gentle pass of a swab, Anne's golden hair reappeared in luminous curls. Her hazel eyes sparked with thoughtful intelligence, and the subtle flush of her cheeks emerged, untouched by any monstrous deformity. The revelation was breathtaking in its simplicity. Anne of Cleves was neither a paragon of impossible beauty nor a hideous beast. She was a real woman, ordinary in the most extraordinary way, embodying a natural grace that had been eclipsed by Henry's malicious spin. As the painting was unveiled to the world, scholars and art lovers alike found themselves gazing upon a face they recognized, not as a symbol of deception, but as a testament to the truth that had long awaited rediscovery. The Louvre's press release spoke of a portrait restored not only in pigment but in reputation, acknowledging that the layers of varnish once concealed both the woman and the injustice done to her. Yet, despite the centuries of slander, the legend of Anne's alleged ugliness persisted in the pages of history books and the scripts of documentary films. The phrase Flanders Mare held its place in popular culture, repeated as though fact, even when the restored portrait lay before one's eyes as irrefutable proof of humanity and nobility. It served as a stark reminder that power, when wielded unkindly, can distort reality and stain a person's name long after they have departed this world. But Anne's true legacy was more than her estates or her restored image. It was the lesson she left behind on how to confront a malicious adversary with calibrated grace. She never fought Henry's lies with open warfare. Instead, she deftly used the mechanisms of court and law to transform an offensive into her liberation. By consenting to the annulment under carefully crafted testimony, she secured not only her freedom, but a substantial jointure that funded her life of comfort and influence. By writing kind, respectful letters to successive monarchs, she preserved her honour and place in the realm, and by quietly adapting her faith, she demonstrated that flexibility, not rigidity, often ensures survival. In the fading light of day, as the shadows lengthen across the corridors of Westminster and the Louvre alike, one might reflect on the paradox of Anne's story that those who exalt themselves on a pedestal of cruelty often find their triumph fleeting, while those who stand quietly on the ground of integrity endure. The burden of malicious rumours did not crush Anne of Cleves. It prompted her to craft a strategy of resilience, transforming every jibe into a stepping stone toward autonomy. More than 4 centuries later, Anne's story waits patiently for those willing to look beyond the myth. Scholars excavate her letters for traces of her bright wit. Artists study her restored portrait for the gentle dignity captured by Holbein's brush. Visitors to Richmond Palace tread softly in the gardens where she once walked, imagining the soft rustle of her silver skirts among the roses. And readers who open history books, eyes heavy with the gravity of bygone courts, might let themselves be lulled by the true chronicle of a princess who, brushed by the darkest of slanders, emerged shining with the quiet radiance of her own making. In the end, the greatest triumph is not the accidental marriage or the royal jointure, but the triumph of spirit, a reminder that one need not brandish a sword to conquer falsehood, but only the steadfast armour of self-respect, and the keenest of minds to navigate the storms of power. Anne of Cleves, in death as in life, stands as a sleeping sentinel of grace, her story a lullaby of fortitude echoing through the halls of history for those who listen. After the storm of annulment and the cruel whispers about her appearance, Anne of Cleves emerged into a new dawn with a vibrancy that seemed to surprise even the most seasoned courtiers. Freed from the shadow of scandal by the generous jointure bestowed upon her, partly in penance for Henry VIII's wounded pride, she took up residence at Richmond Palace and set about transforming it into a haven of refinement and generosity. In the soft glow of candlelit evenings, the palace's great hall rang with laughter, music, and conversation as Anne presided over sumptuous feasts. Tables groaned under platters of roast venison glazed with honey, bowls of delicate potages seasoned with rare spices, and pyramids of sugared almonds that shimmered like dewdrops in the torchlight. Yet it was not mere extravagance that drew guests to her table. It was the warmth of her welcome. She moved among her visitors with the grace of a seasoned hostess, offering goblets of spiced wine to weary travellers and inviting young lords to recite poetry in return for a kindly word. While the other wives of Henry lived in the constant shadow of his unpredictable temper, Anne's life at Richmond was marked by freedom and curiosity. She devoted herself to mastering the English tongue, attending lessons each morning in a small chamber lined with leather-bound primers and phrase books. Her speech, once marked by a German accent, grew ever more fluent and refined, until candles would flicker on her lips when she recited passages from newly published romances or discussed the latest court news with sharp wit. More than language, she absorbed the customs and dress of her adopted homeland. She traded her heavy Flemish gowns for lighter English silks, learning the subtle art of the English farthingale, so her skirts would flare just so. She adopted the small ruff at her throat, its lacework soft as flower petals, and the modest hennin cap worn by Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth. Servants who had once struggled to translate her words found themselves enjoying spirited discussions on the proper way to exchange curtsies and the correct etiquette at masked balls. Letters from Anne's attendants, smuggled back to their families in Cleves, painted a picture far different from the slanderous tales of her supposed coarseness. They spoke of her thoughtful gifts, embroidered purses, filled with coins for the castle's poor, embroidered handkerchiefs scented with roses for her ladies, and painted fans that depicted scenes of German forests and English meadows. They recounted her smiling greetings to stable hands and kitchen maids, her genuine interest in their well-being, and the occasional loaf of freshly baked bread she sent to the city's less fortunate. Word of these deeds spread through London's winding streets and market squares. Townsfolk marvelled that the foreign princess, whom they had been taught to scorn, was, in fact, a figure of kindness and decorum. Gentlemen who had once made sport of Howard's scandal now found themselves speaking respectfully of a princess who had bridged divides with quiet generosity. Preachers in St. Paul's Cathedral even mentioned her charity in their sermons, urging parishioners to follow her example of compassion. Anne's gatherings at Richmond evolved into cultural salons of a sort. Musicians were invited to play on harpsichords and viols, weaving lilting melodies that mingled with the hush of candle smoke. Poets presented their latest verses, dedicating odes to her equanimity and the gracious bloom of her presence. Scholars from Cambridge sometimes travelled south to engage her in theological debate. She, once a Catholic by birth, now an adept student of the new Protestant ideas, and yet still respectful of classical doctrine. These exchanges, held in the palace's sunlit gallery overlooking the river, became a quiet testament to the way Anne's inquisitive spirit enlivened the court's intellectual life. In the privacy of her rooms, she maintained correspondence with friends from her homeland, ensuring that news of England's political shifts reached Cleves. She sent gentle reminders of the peaceful alliance once planned between their lands, though she never pressured them for more than goodwill. Her letters were written in ornate German script. Warmed by the occasional flourish of an English phrase, she had come to favour gracious host, steady heart, gentle spirit. Through these actions, Anne redefined her identity from a pawn in a royal marriage to a respected patron of the arts, a model of cross-cultural diplomacy, and a beacon of empathy. The fearsome power of Henry's slander could not withstand the steady drip of her kindness and competence. Wallflower though she had seemed at first, she had become the beating heart of Richmond's social life. Nobles journeyed from distant manors for the chance to dine at her table and bask in the glow of a princess who had turned exile into opportunity. As seasons turned, reports of her benevolence reached court circles and even the king's own ears. Henry, who had once insisted that she be excised from court memory, could not entirely ignore the acclaim she inspired. Though he never publicly acknowledged her virtues, he allowed her the continued dignity of her title and the full enjoyment of her estates. In the eyes of onlookers, this silence spoke volumes, an unspoken admission that Anne's grace had outlasted his spite. Thus, in the gentle hush of Richmond's twilight, amid the rustle of silken gowns and the soft murmur of complimented guests, Anne of Cleves thrived. She proved that resilience is not merely the ability to endure harm, but the capacity to transform misfortune into flourishing. Her story became a lullaby, carried on the evening breeze, a testament that a woman, wronged by powerful slander, could use the very tools of her oppression to build a new realm of hope and harmony. And so, as candle flames guttered and the river whispered below, the gentle legacy of Anne's reinvention drifted through the corridors, settling softly into the hearts of those who would remember her not as the Flanders Mare, but as the gracious princess who reclaimed her own narrative with quiet brilliance. Historians who delight in dramatic contrasts often line up the fates of Henry's wives like tragic verses in a sombre poem. Catherine of Aragon, steadfast and resolute, found herself cast aside and sent into forlorn exile. her dignity trampled beneath the wheels of political ambition. Anne of Boulogne, fiery and unbowed, bent every effort to please her volatile husband, only to find herself led to the scaffold, her neck laid upon the chopping block in a final, horrific testament to misplaced loyalty. Jane Seymour, sweet and yielding, gave Henry the male heir he craved, only to perish herself in the wake of childbirth. A cruel exchange of life for life. Catherine Howard, innocent in years but naive in caution, succumbed to the allure of forbidden love, her brief bloom cut short by the executioner's blade. And Catherine Parr, shrewd and patient, navigated each of Henry's tempests with careful deference, surviving by the skin of her wits and the pliancy of her words. Yet there, amid so many women who fell victim to the king's capricious will, stood Anne of Cleves' strange anomaly in that line of tragic verse. She alone, falsely accused of ugliness, spared from the fateful coil of poison, the guillotine, or the marrow-deep dread that kept each former queen trembling at every footstep. How had she, the foreign princess blamed for Henry's private failures, managed to slip through the cracks of royal cruelty? The answer lies in her mastery of what one might call the art of prudent yielding. Anne never brandished her intellect as a weapon, nor did she mount a public defence on the turbulent court stage. Instead, she accepted the king's narrative in part, consenting to annulment under terms that safeguarded her life and fortune. She did not contest the absurd tale of her monstrous form, nor did she rail against the physician's crude reports. She allowed the legal processes to run their course, aware that any direct confrontation might provoke the same fate as Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. In the aftermath, when courtiers gossiped of her deficiencies, she chose not to issue scathing retorts, but to cultivate a demeanour of gentle grace. She learned the nuances of English custom, refined her language until her accent was almost indistinguishable, and adorned herself in the silks and laces of the realm, rather than the heavy brocades of her homeland. In every letter to authorities and every public appearance, she radiated civility and respect. These small acts of compliance were more powerful than any open rebellion. They disarmed suspicion and softened even the hardest hearts. Her acquiescence was not a sign of weakness, but of strategy. By refusing to challenge Henry's personal claims directly, she avoided giving him the pretext to escalate his accusations into judicial condemnation. He retained his story of the hideous bride, but without the authority to strip her of her titles or her generous jointure. In effect, Anne turned his slander into a tool for her own preservation, allowing the king's narrative to justify the annulment and her subsequent wealth, while simultaneously ensuring that no further legal action could be taken against her. Thus, she became an exemplar of what might be called wise submission. Rather than meeting cruelty with equal force, she bent like a reed in the storm, only to stand upright once the winds had passed. In her case, yielding did not mean surrender. It meant shifting the axis of power so subtly that even the formidable Henry VIII could not grasp the threads of his own narrative well enough to sever her from her fortunes. Courtiers who once revelled in her disgrace soon found themselves compelled to acknowledge her grace. When she arrived at court functions with a soft curtsy and a serene smile, noble women lowered their eyes before her kindness. Gentlemen who had whispered of her failings now saluted her as the most gracious of duchesses, a title she had earned not through conquest, but through composure. Over time, this approach proved more enduring than overt defiance. Where Catherine of Aragon's incessant petitions and Jane Seymour's maternal devotion invoked pity yet exacted no clemency, Anne's patient withdrawals commanded a reluctant respect. Even Henry, for all his wrath, could not contravene the agreements he had signed. The legal machinery she had utilized moved with the deliberate slowness that a king's hand could not hasten. And so, Anne of Cleves slipped from the king's bedchamber, but remained firmly rooted in the soil of her adopted country. She kept her palatial estates and her yearly revenues, Living out her days in comparative tranquility, her name, though forever linked to the cruel epithet of the Flanders Mare, became a whispered lesson in how to survive under the most brutal of regimes. Generations later, when dramatists penned the tales of Tudor queens, Anne's story was often relegated to a footnote, a curious detour rather than a main event. Yet in the softly spoken anecdotes of her servants, in the gentle rustle of her silken gowns in the Richmond breeze, and in the quiet dignity of her letters, one finds the true measure of her legacy. It is the lesson that power does not belong only to those who wield it with force. It can also reside in the deliberate, unassuming act of choosing one's battles wisely, and in the serene conviction that gentleness can outlast brutality. In that hushed reflection, Anne's fate becomes less an anomaly and more a quiet triumph. She navigated a court where queens perished by poison or blade, and yet, through a blend of tact and restraint, she remained. Her subjects learned that to endure the storm, one need not stand against the gale with clenched fists. One may simply turn the sails just so, and let the wind carry you to calmer waters. Thus, the story of Anne of Cleves stands apart from the thunderous drama of Henry's other marriages. It whispers a lullaby of prudence and grace, a reminder that sometimes the most formidable armour is a soft word, a measured smile, and the wisdom to know when to bow, so that in the end, one may stand free. Anne of Cleves continued to fulfil the amiable role of the fun aunt within the Tudor royal family, a gentle presence who softened the sharp edges of court life. In every royal ceremony, be it a lavish banquet, a solemn procession, or a glittering masque, she arrived with a warm smile and a gracious nod, immediately setting a tone of conviviality. Her laughter, low and melodious, drifted through the corridors of Whitehall and Hampton Court alike, inviting even the most reticent noble to ease their shoulders and join in light-hearted conversation. Children of the realm clustered around her in innocent delight, Mary and Elizabeth. Henry's daughters, by Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn respectively, adored their stepmother's kindness. Mary, with her resolute gaze and pious nature, found in Anne a confidante who spoke to her not as a monarch's daughter, but as a young woman navigating a complex world. Elizabeth, ever curious and bright-eyed, listened eagerly as Anne recounted anecdotes of distant Cleves, painting pictures of snow-laden forests and spring blossoms in faraway Germany. These shared moments wove bonds of affection that transcended the usual barriers of rank and lineage. When Edward VI ascended the throne, his minority reign overseen by regents, Anne's position remained secure. The generous jointure granted to her by Henry VIII was honoured without contest, and the boy King's Council even saw fit to augment her estates, transferring additional lands and revenues into her name. This act, carried out with discreet ceremony, spoke volumes even amid the political manoeuvrings of a new regime. Anne's dignity and the justice of her settlement were respected. She continued to receive her full stipend at the appointed times of Michaelmas and Lady Day, ensuring that her household at Richmond Palace remained well provisioned and that her charitable enterprises could flourish. Anne's discreet adaptability became ever more vital when Mary I, known for her zealous restoration of Catholicism, ascended the throne. Mary's reign brought a fierce crackdown on Protestant clergy, and laypersons alike sermons ended in arrests. Gatherings were broken up by armed guards, and books deemed heretical were publicly burned. In such turbulent times, Anne recognized the necessity of aligning outward practice with the prevailing orthodoxy. Though she had adopted Protestant sympathies during Edward's reign, she now quietly reconverted to Catholic rites, attending Mass with solemn devotion and kneeling for the rosary in the chapel. Her shift in faith was marked by subtlety rather than fanfare. She did not issue public declarations or thrust herself into theological debates. Instead, she merely accepted the new liturgy with serene compliance. Courtiers observed her genuflect before the altar rail and offer the customary sign of the cross. Her chaplain, Previously an advocate of reformist preaching, it was replaced by a priest loyal to Rome, an appointment arranged without scandal or court gossip. In this careful manner, Anne avoided drawing suspicion or ire, preserving both her safety and her status. Through all these changes, rising and falling monarchs, seismic religious reversals, and volatile court factions, Anne maintained her characteristic balance of sincerity and restraint. She continued to host charitable gatherings at Richmond, offering cloaks and food to the poor under Catholic auspices. When Mary's regime demanded piety, she dispatched letters of condolence to victims of religious persecution, phrased in measured language that avoided political controversy. Her guests included noble families, newly restored to favour, as well as retired soldiers and local magistrates seeking her counsel on parish matters. At court, she stood out as a figure of unshakable decorum. Young ladies took inspiration from her practice of wearing modest gowns in subdued hues, deep burgundy, forest green, and chambray blue, each trimmed with fine lace that testified to her refined taste. Gentlemen admired the discreet embroidery on her coif, depicting the sacred monogram Maria, chosen in honour of the Queen's name. When tensions flared between zealous Protestants and staunch Catholics, Anne's presence was like a soothing balm. Her measured courtesy reminded both sides of the human bonds that lay beneath doctrinal disputes. In private correspondence, she penned letters to both Edward's regents and Mary's advisers, expressing loyalty to the crown while carefully avoiding any critique of the prevailing faith. She inquired after the health of the Queen and her council, signing her letters in Latin as Anna Clara, Tua Humilis Soror, or Anne the Noble, your humble sister. These phrases, simple and respectful, underscored her desire to remain connected without overstepping boundaries. Her tactful missives were circulated among the Queen's inner circle, earning her quiet commendations for her loyalty and prudence. Anne's flexibility was not mere opportunism, but a survival strategy born of hard experience. She had witnessed the fates of Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn, both undone by accusations that might have been avoided with greater caution. She had felt the bitter sting of Henry's slander and the precariousness of court favour. Those lessons informed her conduct. She kept neither banners nor pamphlets for any cause, favouring instead the silent affirmation of a devout presence at Mass one day and a discreet prayer at the new Protestant services in private chapels on another. This approach did not escape notice among her contemporaries. Diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors remarked on her wisdom, describing her as a paragon of adaptability, someone who wears conviction as lightly as silk, yet never leaves it behind. It was said in hushed tones that if any courtier wished to learn the art of navigating the Tudor seas, they need look no further than Lady Anne, she who had sailed through the storms of 4 reigns without a single scandal to her name. In that era's tapestry of intrigue, Anne of Cleves wove a strand of quiet stability. Her very presence at court functions signalled respect for the sovereign's person, and her private conduct offered proof of her sincerity. By marrying flexibility with a core of integrity, she transcended the role of a discarded bride and emerged as a respected matron of the realm. In the candlelit hush of late Tudor evenings, one might imagine Anne seated in her drawing room at Richmond, her embroidery frame resting on her lap as she listened to the distant strains of church bells calling the faithful to vespers. Her eyes, still bright with intelligence, would reflect both the flicker of the hearth and the steady light of experience. She would nod to the gentle murmur of prayers recited beyond the garden walls, content in the knowledge that her adaptability had shielded her through the darkest of times. Thus, Anne of Cleves exemplified the art of graceful survival, a woman who, buffeted by royal caprice and doctrinal upheaval, found safety and respect in the gentle consistency of her presence and the wisdom of her choices. In Tudor memory, where so many voices were silenced by blade or banishment, her softly spoken example endured a lullaby of prudence and poise for generations to come. In the year 1557, a hushed sorrow swept through the courts of England as Anne of Cleves drew her final breath, her frail frame succumbing most likely to a relentless illness we now recognize as cancer. The chill of winter had begun to fade, and yet a greater chill settled upon the capital. For a princess, beloved for her gentle spirit, was no more. Word of her passing travelled from Richmond's quiet halls to London's grand avenues, carried on the hushed sobs of attendants and the measured tread of mourning processions. Her burial at Westminster Abbey was conducted with an almost reverential solemnity. Monks in sable robes chanted Gregorian chants that echoed beneath the soaring vaulted ceilings, their voices drifting like a soft lament across the polished stone. Nobles and clergy stood arrayed in their finest mourning silks of deep crimson and ebony, yet no whisper of scandal marred the ceremony. Henry's infamous epithet Flanders Mare paled into irrelevance in that sacred space, replaced by words that paid tribute to her character rather than her appearance. Upon her tomb, the Latin inscription read simply yet profoundly, Anne of Cleves, princeps in gratia et virtute renominata, cuius cordi humanita et munificentia perpetu memoriae instituanda sunt. Translated, it honours Anne of Cleves, a princess renowned for grace and virtue, whose humanity and generosity shall be ever enshrined in memory. No scrawled rumours of bodily failings, no echoes of royal spite, only a celebration of her devotion, her kindness, and her nobility. Meanwhile, far from the hushed abbey, in the luminous halls of the Louvre, the different kind of ceremony unfolded centuries later. Conservators, working by lamplight under the watchful gaze of silent marble statues, carefully removed the thick layers of darkened varnish and centuries of accumulated grime from Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne. The painting had once been subdued beneath overzealous restorations and intentionally obscured to lend credence to Henry's malicious narrative, but now, as each delicate brush and solvent swab revealed the true depth of the artist's intent, the face beneath the shadows emerged with startling clarity. Anne's golden hair shone once more, its soft waves cascading over her shoulders as though lit from within. Her hazel eyes, which had long been described in court gossip as dull or hollow tales spun to mask, the king's own failures now glowed with intelligence and warmth. Her skin, once rumoured to be rough and unappealing, lay smooth and softly flushed, imbued with the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered storms of rumour and power with unbroken poise. The restoration was not merely an artistic triumph, but a reclamation of truth. The portrait stood as irrefutable evidence that Anne had never been monstrous, only human. When the restored painting was unveiled, the art world held its breath. Critics and scholars gathered to behold the rediscovered visage, many murmuring in awe at the realization that history's most enduring lie had been born of envy and wounded pride, not fact. The Louvre's catalogue spoke of a woman of measured grace, neither a paragon of impossible beauty nor a creature of repellent deformity, but a gentle presence rendered immortal by the master's hand. In the soft hush of the gallery, visitors lingered before the canvas, letting its serenity wash over them like a whispered apology from centuries past. For Anne's own memory, this revival of her likeness was nothing short of vindication. It mattered little that the epithet Flanders Mare persisted in dusty textbooks and popular dramas. The world now possessed a vision of the woman behind the myth, a woman of poise, of kindness, of unwavering dignity. The painting spoke a language more potent than any royal decree. It declared that power may paint its own narratives. But art endure, carrying the truth through generations. In reflecting upon Anne's life and the toll exacted by Henry's cruelty, one sees that her true victory lay not in vanquishing the king's claims, but in transcending them. She had taken the instruments of her oppression lawsuits, slanders, forced testimonies, and, like a skilled alchemist, transmuted them into the gold of autonomy and respect. She emerged from the wreckage of her first marriage not broken, but reinforced by the very trials meant to destroy her. Her generous jointure funded her benevolence. Her quiet submission to political necessity preserved her safety. Her cultivated grace in adversity endeared her to children and courts alike, and in death, she was commemorated not as the queen who offended the king's ego, but as a paragon of virtue deserving of the highest honours. The restored portrait, now luminous in its frame, stands as a final testament, a woman of flesh and blood, neither more astonishingly beautiful nor hideously ugly, but possessed of a calm strength that outshone every cruel whisper. It invites each beholder to look beyond rumour and to embrace the dignity inherent in every human face. Thus, as Westminster's choir fell silent and the candles guttered to their last, Anne of Cleves entered her rest, her legacy sealed in stone and pigment alike. The cruel tales of her supposed ugliness dissolved before the quiet power of truth, leaving behind not scandal, but a story of resilience. In her journey from scorned bride to beloved matron, she showed that the greatest freedom lies not in defeating one's enemies by force, but in reclaiming one's own narrative with unwavering grace. And so, in the gentle twilight of memory, Anne's name endures no longer as a footnote in the annals of a tyrant's whims, but as a lullaby of fortitude, a serene reminder that dignity, once claimed, can never be truly stolen. In centuries to come, when readers gaze upon Holbein's carefully restored image, they will see not the Flanders Mare, but the radiant truth of a princess who refused to be defined by a king's wound pride, choosing instead to shine with her own quiet light. The greatest legacy Anne of Cleves left behind was not her palatial estates, nor the vast revenues that once made her one of England's wealthiest women, but rather a profound lesson in confronting dictatorial power and wounded pride. One need not raise arms in open defiance or shout one's indignation from the rooftops. Instead, through a judicious practice of wise yielding, she secured a silent victory that resonated far beyond her own lifetime. Consider the stubborn persistence of the legend of the Flanders Mare, a myth born of Henry VIII's wounded ego, which endured in popular culture for 5 long centuries. It serves as a cautionary whisper, reminding us how readily we accept the word of the strongest voice in the room, often without pause to question the motives behind it. In countless history books, in film and theatre, Anne's supposed ugliness became shorthand for betrayal, as though the inability to consummate a royal marriage were ever truly a matter of appearance rather than of circumstance, of illness, of private failings. Yet through Holbein's brushstrokes, now cleansed by time and restoration, we glimpse the truth. Anne was neither monstrously hideous nor divinely perfected, but a woman of very human grace and intelligence. It was this very grace that Anne harnessed to transform slander into freedom. She never publicly flouted the king's accusations, nor did she challenge the physician's lurid reports with equal vitriol. Instead, she chose the subtler path, consenting to annulment on terms that protected her life and her jointure, adopting the customs of her adopted land so completely that the foreignness Henry had once decried became a mere footnote in her story, and extending kindness and support to those around her so consistently that even the most skeptical courtiers found themselves won over by her gentle sincerity. In doing so, Anne demonstrated a strategic wisdom seldom taught in schools of power. Her approach reveals that sometimes the most formidable resistance is not to stand directly against the tyrant's blade, but to bend just enough so that the blade passes harmlessly by aligning her outward actions with the shifting demands of each monarch, Henry's whims, Edward's reforms, Mary's restoration. She kept her footing on treacherous ground, preserving both her autonomy and her honour. Her story reminds us that power is not only wielded by those who shout the loudest, but also by those who choose their moments of assertion with care. Anne's soft-spoken diplomacy outlasted Henry's thunderous proclamations. Her courteous letters outlived the king's spiteful rumours, her dignified presence at every royal function, never demanding attention, yet always commanding respect, stood in stark contrast to the volatile dramas of the throne. Generations later, visitors to Richmond Palace wander through the rose gardens she once tended, perhaps unaware of the battles she quietly fought. Art historians pore over Holbein's restored portrait, marveling at the serene intelligence in her gaze, and readers who turn the pages of Tudor chronicles may pause, lulled by the steady rhythm of her life's arc, to consider that the most enduring kind of victory can arrive not with a clash of swords, but in the silent reclamation of one's own narrative. Anne of Cleves' experience offers a timeless lesson. Sometimes the greatest triumph is allowing one's adversary to believe they have won, while quietly securing the freedom to live one's life on one's own terms. In this gentle surrender, there lies a power that no decree can overturn, no rumour can tarnish, and no force can seize away. As the centuries fall away, leaving only the echo of her story, Anne remains a sleeping sentinel of fortitude. Her legacy is a lullaby for those who seek strength in subtlety, a reminder that dignity and wisdom can outlast the harshest storms of oppression. And in the hush of history's twilight, one hears her gentle counsel that true freedom often blooms not from the storm of confrontation, but from the quiet art of bending so nimbly that even the strongest wind cannot uproot your roots. In closing, Anne of Cleves' story offers us a gentle yet powerful lesson in resilience and the subtle art of self-preservation. Rather than confronting tyranny with force or angry protest, she chose a path of measured compliance and quiet dignity, turning the very slanders meant to destroy her into stepping stones toward freedom. From her acceptance of the annulment structured, so that she walked away wealthy and alive, to her thoughtful adaptation to each new monarch's demands, she demonstrated how a composed spirit can outlast the fiercest storms of power. This tale reminds us that true strength often lies in flexibility, not in brute resistance. Anne's wise yielding allowed her to maintain her integrity and autonomy in an environment where most of her peers fell victim to jealousy, scandal, or outright violence. By mastering the customs and language of her adopted country, showing kindness to every level of society, and keeping her counsel and faith aligned with the prevailing winds, she secured a place of respect and affection that endured long after Henry VIII's reign ended. For viewers of this video, Anne's journey invites reflection on how we face our own challenges. When we encounter unfair criticism, or when powerful forces threaten to define us by their accusations, we can ask ourselves, might there be a strategic way to preserve our dignity without escalating the conflict? Can we use goodwill and adaptability to carve out a safe space, rather than engaging in battles we cannot win? Anne teaches us that sometimes the most profound victories are achieved not by charging head-on, but by steering gently, maintaining our core values while adjusting our sails. Beyond strategy, her legacy speaks to the enduring power of reputation and narrative. Henry's lie about her appearance, repeated for centuries, showed how easily a dominant voice can shape public perception. Yet art and time intervened in the form of Holbein's restored portrait, reminding us that truth, once buried, can be brought back into the light. In a world flooded with sound bites and social media judgments, Anne's experience underscores the importance of questioning the stories we hear and seeking out the fuller picture. Ultimately, Anne of Cleves leaves us with a lullaby of hope that even under the harshest scrutiny, a calm heart and a clever mind can transform adversity into liberation. Her life encourages us to approach our trials with quiet courage, to recognize when to bend and when to hold firm, and to believe that, sometimes, the greatest triumph is letting others think they have won while you, in fact, have found your own way to freedom.